In the year 1820 in rural Virginia, John was one of the few male slaves on a tobacco plantation owned by a wealthy white widow named Mrs. Dalton. She had inherited the plantation from her late husband and relied on her many slaves to keep it running. John worked long, grueling hours in the fields under the blazing sun. At night he would return to the cramped slave quarters exhausted, but he could find no rest there either. Mrs. Dalton would often summon John to the main house after dark. She forced him to satisfy her sexual urges against his will, abusing her power over him as his owner. John felt ashamed and angry at being exploited in this way. But as a slave, he could not stop it. If he refused or fought back, he could be beaten or sold away from his family at Mrs. Dalton's whim. And who would believe him if he told the truth about what she did to him at night? This pattern continued for years as Mrs. Dalton took her pleasure with John whenever she desired. His body was not his own, but merely one more piece of property for his mistress to use and abuse. Inside, he felt rage growing, but also a deepening sense of despair that this would be his lot in life forever. An object to be exploited, never treated as a human being. When sexual abuse during the time of slavery is viewed, it's discussed along the lines of gender. There's a lot of evidence to highlight the sexual struggles of enslaved black women, but little information on the sexual exploitation enslaved black men faced. Back then, whenever the male slave owners weren't around, their wives, sisters, and mothers took it upon themselves to taunt the enslaved men and coerce them into sex. But when we look at how society handles cases of sexual violence, we see why the exploitation of enslaved black men would go unnoticed. When a female victim of sexual violence steps forward, they are asked why they didn't make better choices to avoid the situation. It's the same way men are asked, why can't you be a man and protect yourself? To fully understand the sexual exploitation of black male slaves by white women, we have to take off, while partially putting on, the lens of gender bias. In the 18th century, when slavery wasn't already abolished, white women played traditional gender roles. They were seen as the guardians of the homes and were responsible for keeping the values and morals in the house. So while their husbands were out lashing their whips and conquering nations, they stayed back to take care of the children and home. These white women didn't work, had no hobbies, and spent most of their time in the house. Many of them were sexually frustrated as their husbands couldn't be bothered to meet their sexual needs. With no other place to turn, they took advantage of the enslaved black men under them. Throughout history, black bodies have always been objectified and sexualized. It was the same case with Sarah Bartman, the slave brought from Koiku, who was sexualized and demonized for her curvy hips. What was normal in her tribe became a reason for white men and women to sexualize her body and turn it into a spectacle. She was placed in a cage and treated like an object for white men to take out their borderline psychopathic fetishes on. Throughout her lifetime until her death, Sarah suffered at the hands of these people who never respected her as a human. Her story is just one of the millions of examples of how black bodies have been treated. The women are idolized for their curvaceous hips and fuller busts, and that hasn't stopped throughout history. It's the same fetish that had a hold on the transatlantic slave owners that many of their descendants possess and exhibit when they treat black women as objects that are created for their satisfaction. Black slave men were sexualized for their natural body tone, chiseled abs, and facial structure. Their hard work in the plantation and cotton fields made them appear as strong men capable of doing any amount of work. The unspoken rule then was the more work a slave did, the more work they needed. Rest was a myth during these times for enslaved black men, and it was only a matter of time before white women started using them for their selfish satisfaction. Back then, being sexually exploited as an enslaved black man was seen as a privilege. The other enslaved men would feel jealous and assume the sexually exploited man was doing a bad thing to enjoy favors. They assumed it was a sexual relationship that came with multiple benefits. However, looking at the context of the situation with significant differences in status, rank, and racial hierarchy, can it be considered a consensual sexual relationship? Due to racism, when black people get accused of any crime, they are villainized before they get a chance to redeem themselves, and it has stayed that way through history. So you may wonder, but why couldn't these enslaved men just protect themselves? They were mentally incapable of doing so because going against the master's wife was a surefire way of getting killed for no reason. But why were these women able to get away with such heinous acts? The answer is the reason why I said you'd have to partially view the issue through traditional gender biases. Women, white women to be precise, have always been viewed as moral and pure. Their role was to maintain the peace of the house and rear children while pandering to their husbands' needs. As Christian women, they were valued for their homemaking abilities, supposed virtue, and maternal instincts. According to a South Carolina periodical letter geared towards young women, if a female possesses beauty, wealth, and, in short, all the accomplishments which wealth can purchase, without virtue she is worth nothing. Her accomplishments may be admired by some for a little while, it is true, but she will never be truly esteemed. Permit me to ask, which would you rather have, virtue without accomplishments, or accomplishments without virtue? The essence of this letter was to delude young women into believing that they didn't need to accomplish things if they had a good personality. While it seems like a delusion now, back then, it was exactly how white women were viewed. Since white men viewed their women as inferior and less smart, they never assumed that they were capable of doing anything wrong. For these white men, their women couldn't protect themselves from the supposed evil of the enslaved black men, and as such, the slaves had to be punished. In 1882, Elder confirmed this bias for white women when he said, "The honor and virtue Southerners attributed to white women, especially of the upper class, was nearly synonymous with a reputation for sexual purity, sustained by restraint, prudence, and modesty in every area of life. Sexually abused, enslaved black men couldn't defend themselves because the sexuality of white women was heavily regulated by culture and law. White supremacist ideas demonized black women and placed white women on a ridiculously high pedestal. Adultery was judged more harshly on white women than on white men, so they had to keep themselves pure and avoid affairs that could question their husband's ability. If the white mistresses could live above reproach, their husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers could boast of the superiority of their civilization. So when it was discovered that a white woman had slept with a black enslaved man, someone who was viewed as less important in society, the white community went into a frenzy. To protect herself, the white woman would accuse the slave of sexual assault, and that slave would be genitally mutilated or killed. If a child were to be produced through a white woman's coercion of a black enslaved man, the child was either sold into slavery or killed. Giving birth to mixed-race children as a white woman was a shameful act. Not only were enslaved black men used to sexually gratify white women, but their resulting offspring were used to continue the slave trade. Enslaved black men didn't only suffer sexual abuse from white women, as white men not only violated them but also forced them into violating enslaved black women. As history continues to unfold, we will need to view sexual violence through the lens of racial differences during the time of slavery. White women used their position as damsels in distress to prey on enslaved black men who just wanted to survive. The same white supremacist idea is what invented the phrase, "white woman tears." If a white woman can cry her way out of a situation, even when she's wrong, an unsuspecting black man will suffer. Is there anything you'd like to learn about our black ancestors? Then leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel so we can keep creating more melanin-rich videos. See you next time. Peace.